And it's turned 4 o'clock, so I'm going to make a start. And welcome to this session, Social Work Workforce Story, as we see it, Research Findings 2023. Really excited about this session and looking forward to it a lot. My name is Vicky Hart. I'm Regional Engagement Lead for London at Social Work England. I'm just going to read through some housekeeping slides before I hand over to our presenters today. And yeah, there we go. Our legal disclaimer, which is that any views, information or opinions expressed by third parties during Social Work Week are the speaker's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Social Work England or its employees. Social Work England have not endorsed third-party content. Social Work England accepts no liability for content of third-party or sector-led sessions during Social Work Week. So just the privacy notice that your privacy is important to us. By providing personal information such as your name and email address, you agree to us contacting you for purposes of event management and evaluation. Your personal information will be used solely by us for the purpose it's collected, and personal data will be retained for up to 3 years in accordance with our data retention schedule.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session. It's very good that you've given the time this afternoon to come and listen to the story about the workforce research, the views of social workers and the views of the public about social work. Before I move to our presenters, I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Sue Ross, and I'm chairing this session on behalf of Social Work England. I'm a registered social worker with Social Work England, and I've been a social worker this is my 50th year in social work, and I'm still working in social work currently. You'll see the backdrop behind me of a council logo. I'm sitting in a council office at the moment. So you can imagine I'm really interested in what the research says and the importance of it. I'm also a member of the Social Work England board. I've been a member of the board for about 3 years now. And on behalf of the board, I'm here this afternoon. So I'm going to invite Katie and Paul to introduce themselves just now. Katie.
Thanks, Sue. Hi, everybody. Yes, my name's Katie Newbould. I'm Head of Policy at Social Work England, and I'll be presenting the second piece of research. Paul?
Classic rookie error. I'm Paul, Policy Manager, and I'll be presenting the first part of the research. So.
Thank you very much, both of you. Before I hand over to the presenters, I just want to give a brief overview of the agenda, and it's there in front of you. The first presentation, as you can see, is about some recently published perceptions of social work, some research about that. The second session that Paul that Katie is going to lead is a presentation on the findings of, again, some recently published research about the views of social workers about their profession. And then we're going to have time for some Q&A, and we are going to have the illustrations from Nifty Fox. I don't think that's going to be live, but we'll say a bit more about that later. So just moving on, before we move into the presentations, I want to just say a few words about why research is important in regulation, why Social Work England has taken the opportunity to get into this area, because a commitment to learning about the public's views of social work and the workforce is really important to Social Work England as a regulator. How the vital role that social work plays in society and affects the people we work with, as well as the lived experience of social workers themselves, has to form the basis of some of our thinking about developing in developments in the workforce and some of the challenges that we're all facing on a day-to-day basis. So we're gathering data about the profession, about the work that informs our activities as the specialist regulator for social work in England. And research is one way this is done in Social Work England, but there are other forms of data intelligence gathering too. For instance, engagement and consultation events with social workers and the public and the people we support.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sue. And I'll remember the space button to take myself off mute. So let's get going. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to be speaking to you about the first of our two pieces of research, the one into public perceptions of social work as a profession. So 2023, we commissioned YouGov, which is an organisation I'm sure many of you have heard of, big experts in polling and market research, to investigate how people in England feel about the profession. So we wanted to know more about whether they understand what it is, what social workers do, to what extent they have confidence in social work in England, and as well as how they feel about the regulation of the profession by us. So the research work, just to kind of set the scene, it took place during spring. I think it was about 3 months. YouGov recruited 3,032 members of the public, 444 NHS workers other than social workers, and then 110 social workers. So they were the three sort of audience groups for the online survey stage. And that's where all the statistical findings that I'm about to kind of present come from. And indeed, as Sue said, there's plenty more statistics in the report. And to enrich that, they also held some focus groups and some in-depth interviews with individual respondents. And that included healthcare professionals and social workers and people with lived experience of social work support. So that element of research was designed to kind of interrogate some of the statistics and include some of the kind of extra perspectives and sort of insights that you can get from those kind of face-to-face conversations. Next slide, please. So we started off. I will just say that YouGov produced the findings for most of the questions for the general public, adults in England, for healthcare professionals, and then for social workers. Not all of those groups reported on under every question, but you'll just need to keep an eye on these sort of double or triple bars. The dark green is the adults in England, and the orange is the healthcare professionals. So just make a mental note of that, and you'll see social workers popping up later in pink. The first topic that we asked about was whether people understand what social work is, what they do, and why. And unsurprisingly, healthcare professionals were a bit better informed, but the results, I think, for the general public weren't too bad. The majority of people understand, 8 in 10 people actually understand that social workers can be employed by local councils, and just short of 60% named the NHS as another employer. And then obviously slightly lower statistics for the other options there. Now, inside the data, I'm not sure this is kind of earth-shattering, this particular finding, but there are some interesting sort of differences. Next slide, please. We'll kind of pick up on this as we go. So perhaps slightly curiously, YouGov identified some statistically significant differences between men and women. Women slightly more likely to know that social workers work for local councils or the courts, and men more likely to think they work for charities. There were also some regional differences. Next slide, please. I don't know what's going on in London or the West Midlands, but they scored significantly lower than everywhere else in England in terms of knowing who employs social workers. Nearly 10% difference there. And in the West Midlands, people were nearly twice as likely not to know where social workers work at all. So there are all sorts of differences within and between different categories of people, and YouGov has highlighted these in the report. So they're not all findings on which we need to do something straight away, but I think it just helps us to get a picture that below all the headline findings is a real mix of responses and voices. And I'm sure as people use this research in different ways, both here at Social Work England and elsewhere, we'll find useful snippets to help inform the different kind of work that we do to support the profession. I think certainly our regional engagement team will be interested in those West Midlands and London numbers. Next slide, please. So we moved on to ask about the features of social work. Now, an encouraging 2/3 of members of the public knew that social workers have to complete a recognised qualification, 67%, rising to 87% among healthcare professionals. I think as a baseline, that's not bad. But remember, this is just adults in England asked cold. So, this is just from the off at the beginning of the survey. Just over half of people knew that social workers are regulated in general terms. But interestingly, only a quarter knew that they could see a social worker's professional details on a publicly available register. And obviously both statistics were higher, quite a lot higher among healthcare professionals. Many of them will obviously be themselves regulated professionals by different regulators, so they'll know all about that side of things. And we'll see later on that the fact of regulation does give people confidence in social work as a profession. So it's interesting to see that fewer than half of those who knew about regulation in general terms knew specifically about the public register. Next slide, please. We asked people who they thought social workers worked with. I say we, it was YouGov, but we'll take some of it. Broadly speaking, people's understanding of social work, and this comes out quite clearly in the report, is child-centric, focuses primarily on children and on people at risk of harm. So that's true both among the general public and among the healthcare professionals. Adults and older adult social work is not as widely sort of named initially, and only 13% of the general public named adults and 16% named older adults as groups that social workers support. Now, in the interviews that I mentioned, YouGov found that people who thought social workers worked with older adults in particular were often confusing social workers and social care workers, which may explain the lower numbers. And there's also, I think more media attention on social work for children and families, both in the news and entertainment. And you'll be aware of our Change the Script campaign, which has been mentioned. So that's part of the kind of consideration there. Next slide, please. As well as asking who social workers work with, we asked whether they knew what they do day to day. As you can see, paperwork came out on top. Not probably a surprise to anyone. But almost the same number. We're only talking about 60 to 67% for all of these responses. So almost the same number recognised that social workers talk to other professionals about the people they're supporting. And I think that's interesting given the sort of centrality of interprofessional working to social work. And again, we can see harm as another top theme, with reporting abuse allegations coming in there with 64. Now, they are all very close together, but we do then have removing children or adults from families and placing them in care. Now, on the surface, I think perhaps a bit disappointing, but we're going to get some more detail on that on the next slide, please. So hold that thought. We wanted to explore some of these negative stereotypes, and YouGov draws attention to the quotes child snatcher sort of narrative in particular, which does exist out there. We know about that. So this question asked how often people thought social workers separated children from their families, and so we're keener on the yellow and pink here. That's the rarely or sometimes, and actually that gave us 70% overall. Rarely or sometimes separate children from families. 13% said often or always, and as you can see, hardly anyone actually said always. So while there is a stereotype there, it perhaps isn't as overwhelming as I might have expected. I think can seem the case sometimes, and I refer again to Change the Script campaign, which we hope will have a powerful role in changing that, writing the balance a bit. We asked the same question of healthcare professionals who are obviously a bit closer to social work, and they're pink and yellow. They're rarely or sometimes 87%, with just 5% saying often. So I think we'd like to see the public numbers tick that way a bit more. Next slide, please. We asked people how confident they are that social workers are able to do their job well. And again, there are the initial findings here and then some more detail in the next slide. So I think given the pressures that I think are widely recognised across the public sector, I don't really think these findings are too bad as a starting point. More than half of adults in England were fairly confident that social workers could do a good job. And another 6%, just the icing on the cake, were completely confident, which was good. Now, both those figures rise among healthcare professionals, and encouragingly, they also rise again among social workers, where just shy of a quarter were completely confident and 2/3 were fairly confident. So we might hope for more completelys, and we might hope for fewer in the not confident bar, which for adults in England was 29%, which is, disappointingly high. But people are sympathetic about the reasons for social workers not being able to do a good job. I don't think we've got a chart on this, but 68% of the public, which is more than the total of the fairly and the completely confident people, 68% identified overwork as a barrier to better practice, and 94% of social workers said the same. Half of the public identify that the services that social workers either do or should be able to refer to are inadequate or not present, and 45% of the public cited too much paperwork. So while we do want to see some shifting of the views in this chart, I think the research does suggest that public understanding, public sympathy is there for the reasons, behind some of these findings. Next slide, please. Now, although, as I say, there are some stereotypes, which I don't think anyone will be surprised by, there are some encouraging findings when we ask people about how social workers are viewed, what their values are. Now, although understanding, as I said, the detail was skewed towards children's social work, people are overwhelmingly sympathetic to social work broadly and their professional aims. 3/4 believe, they agreed with the statement, social workers want the best for people, which I think we can bank that. 62% say that social workers make a big difference in people's lives, and just over half believe that. I'm keen on this one in particular. Just over half believe that social workers are experts in understanding and meeting people's needs. So the qualitative interviews and the focus groups found that across all audience groups, I like this line in the report, social workers are largely seen as essential to the continued functioning of society. So that's some fairly good feedback there. They also highlighted that without the support that social workers offer, many people just wouldn't receive care that is essential to them, especially older people, people with severe mental ill health, people in poverty, and children. So again, the detailed understanding, the sort of statistical understanding may not be there, but broadly, people are very sympathetic towards the aims and purposes of social work. The interviews also show that the most negative feelings towards social work, such as those who don't have any confidence that social workers can do a good job, are largely attributed to structural reasons that lead to poor social work, rather than predisposition for uncaring or unskilled individuals to be doing the job. So people, even those who are down on social work, actually understand that there are underpinning reasons. Still work to do to improve public perceptions, but I think we're not without hope for some good results in the future. Next slide, please. Now, the qualitative research also found that social workers believe their work is misunderstood by broader society, which leads to the negative perception of social workers, and that is almost universally attributed to the media, both entertainment and news. That's seen as quite a powerful influence. The large majority of social workers feel that the media, focuses on failings and ignores cases, of success in supporting vulnerable individuals and families. I don't need to tell you about all the different kinds of inaccuracy that people perceive, but there was some statistical differences between ethnic groups, and I think this is quite interesting on this chart. So overall, people from ethnic minority groups were less likely to agree that social workers want the best for the people they work with than people from white ethnic backgrounds were. 10% difference there. So 68% of people from an ethnic minority background, as opposed to 76% of white background people. But people from a black ethnic background were more positive across all these indicators. So 82% of them agreed that social workers wanted the best for people. They're more they're more likely than other groups. 74% as opposed to 62 felt that social work could make a big difference, which is the second line on the graph there. And then the third line, 66% rather than 33, so that they're experts in understanding and meeting need. So there is there are rather disappointing finding that 10% of people at the bottom of the chart think that social work could be done by other professions with no special training. But YouGov in the report, having tested that finding out in the interview, said that it was fairly common for people to confuse social workers with social care workers, which I think explains a part of that. I think I said 10, actually it's 18, isn't it? But that's not to say that we necessarily agree with the view that social care workers don't need training and aren't qualified and professions, but the focus of this research was on social work and the perceptions of that, so that's why we have these findings. And 2/3 of people did disagree with that, so we're again something to build on. Next slide, please. Now, this one's picked up a bit of chatter. We asked how well respected people think these groups are in society. Just to note, we didn't ask how do you respect social workers or doctors or pharmacists? We ask, how well respected do you think they are in society? So doctors came top of the list for everyone, as you can see there, 90% of everyone else and 99% of social workers. And then the list is sort of broadly consistent, some difference in place. It's the healthcare and sort of medical related regulated professions at the top, the nurses, the pharmacists, the physios in the 80s and 90s. Then there's a little drop for the lawyers and the teachers, about 10 to 15% fewer said that they were well respected in society. And then we have a difference in the lists. So the public put social workers next. 44% of the public felt that social workers were respected, but social workers themselves, they put themselves right at the bottom of the list. They said 11% said the same thing. So for the public, the police officers and bankers came next, trailing in with 30 odd social workers. They put the police officers and bankers ahead of themselves. So among the public, social work scored 4 times higher, 44%, as I say, were respected or felt they were respected ahead of police and bankers. And we heard earlier in the presentation, if you were at the Chief Exec's one, about the meaning of being a regulated professional, Social Care Wales have asked a similar question there and found that 3 times as many members of the public in Wales felt that social workers were respected compared to social workers in Wales. So not unsurprising, I think. YouGov's qualitative research found that social workers are acutely aware of that lack of respect compared to other caring professions, and there are lots of reasons that people perceive that, and obviously the research bears it out. But I think it's another indication that the wider public are more positive, more sympathetic than social work than I think many of us would have assumed. So not the be all and end all of research, as I say, there has been some interest in this finding, but I think there are some heartening messages from this for social workers. Next slide, please. Just for a break from the bar charts, we asked people what words they associated with social workers, which gave us some interesting contrast. Now, the most popular answers across all groups were under-resourced and overworked. Again, this is not terribly surprising findings, but still useful and interesting. Now, the next 6 options were all positive, which is encouraging. Empathetic, trustworthy, accountable, honest, fair and reliable, ranging from 36% for empathetic to 19% for fair. So substantially lower than overworked and under-resourced, which I think are up in the 60s, but the order is encouraging. All the negative words came out at the bottom. The highest scoring negative association was incompetent, which only got 16%, higher than we would like, but still low. Now, there were differences between social workers and members of the public. Social workers were 20% more likely to say they were under-resourced and overworked. And healthcare professionals in the interviews suggested that where they had answered that social workers weren't necessarily able to provide a good service, it was because of those feelings of overwork and under-resourcing and lack of support from budgets and workload pressures and that kind of thing. One interesting finding, I think, is that at the very, very bottom of the list, after all the negative characteristics, was transparent, which only got 7% of people indicating that they thought that. But for my part, I kind of wonder if that's just, it could be a bit of a jargon word, but it's certainly something that I think it would be good as a policy person to kind of explore in future work. So that was an interesting finding from that question. Next slide, please. Now, YouGov asked, if someone you knew was getting support from a social worker, how would you feel about it? The prevailing opinion, just under half, they will be getting the help that they need, which is, I think, an all right answer to see there. Just under a third said they'd be worried about what would happen, and a similar number said that the person's life would improve, and just 12% said they thought the person's life would get worse. So again, we have findings that combine, with all the other sort of stuff to help us understand a bit more how, where the public sympathy lays in relation to the profession. We can say a majority of people are positive about the aims of social work and the impact that social workers have on people's lives. And it's a good basis, I think, on which to build a campaign to persuade the others. So interestingly, these findings are consistent among those whose friends and family members have experienced the social work and those answering hypothetically. So there was no sort of statistical difference between those 2 groups. Next slide, please. Racing towards my deadline. This is more slides than I've ever spoken to before. We asked healthcare professionals what impact they thought social workers had on healthcare more broadly. This was a question obviously just for the healthcare professionals. Pleasingly, more than 3/4 said very or fairly positive. So, in the NHS and in the healthcare system more broadly, people are positive about the impact that social workers have. And I think, given the commitment of social workers to enabling and doing multi-professional, interprofessional working, that's a good one. So YouGov added that among those who interact with social workers frequently, among the healthcare professionals, that rises to more than 90%. So that's one we can take to the bank. Next slide, please. some quotes now. I won't read them out, but in the qualitative research, there was a mix of levels of knowledge and views on the awareness of and effectiveness of professional regulators. So there's some confusion in particular around whether regulators are there to protect the public or the professionals or both. So there's some valuable learning, I think, for us and our communications about regulation. And I'm sure other regulators will be interested in that as well. There's a question around how much sort of specific detail we need the general public to know and how that compares to people who do have direct contact with social workers and other professionals and therefore need to know that. But I think that's something that we will be looking to build on. And overall, participants felt that having a regulator does reflect well on the profession and it increases their confidence that they have in the quality of social work. Even in light, I think, of that finding earlier that they may not know about the public register specifically. I think just the fact of the existence of a regulator itself, does give some encouragement. I think the next slide, please. I think that's about a bit more detail. Yes, we asked some views about what people thought our role was. Half of people who gave an answer to this thought that one of our roles was to set professional standards, which is a tick. That's the highest score for any of the sort of potential functions that were offered. Slightly fewer knew that we keep that register. And as I say, only half as many as that knew that the register was publicly available, which is interesting. And you can see there's mixed understanding of our specific functions, but there was understanding among respondents, and this was borne out in the qualitative interviews, that this means that you could complain if something went wrong, and that there is accountability there. That was 39% of people answered for both of those points. A third felt that having a regulator meant they could trust social workers to act professionally, and a quarter said that it meant they could be confident that social workers would work to a set of standards, and that they promote rights, strengths, and well-being of people. 26%. Healthcare professionals and social workers kind of came in about 10% higher on all those questions. So overall, YouGov's sort of finding for us was that regulation is particularly valued and that it does drive overall confidence in the profession. Next slide, please. I think my final one. Yes, so again, I won't read the detail. I'm not sure I could actually, it's too small, but the case studies in the research, if you scroll down past the sort of pages with the bar charts, YouGov have provided some case studies and they give some sort of anonymized examples of how all the findings combine for different respondents. So it gives a really rich picture of how all these different opinions and sort of levels of understanding combine for different people and different audiences. The research, as I say, is fully published and it's available to view. There's a summary and there's the whole research paper. We're not publishing it to draw specific conclusions overall or to pat ourselves or anybody else on the back, or equally we're not wanting to sort of give a downbeat picture and start moaning about things. It's to add to the evidence base that we have across the board that will support and inform our work and our functions. I've mentioned the Change the Script campaign, and so we've referred to our engagement work, both directly by us and organisations with the sector. So we hope that it will provide some useful insights and information, and a bit of encouragement to social work about some of those views around public sympathy. So thank you for walking with me through those findings. I hope that wasn't too much of a gallop, but now it's time for me to reintroduce Katie, who I think will pop up on screen and talk to us about the social work workforce research. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so a separate piece of research, but with some similarities and crossovers, so hence why we've put them together in the same session. But this second piece of research focuses on the workforce itself, and we commissioned, again, YouGov, completely by accident, to help us better understand the social work workforce. And it looked at how social workers move around the profession, the impact that vacancies and other issues have on the existing workforce, and how workplace culture impacts on the ability to recruit and retain staff. Now, we wanted to build on the research that we'd commissioned in 2020 into perceptions of social work. And whilst this research does make some comparisons with the 2020 findings, the two pieces are independent, and the sample composition was different. So there is a limit to which we can make those comparisons. The research took place in summer 2023, and the team recruited just short of 1,400 current and former social workers for the research, which comprised surveys, interviews, and focus groups. And there was also interviews with social work employers and also people with lived experience of social work. But you can find a more comprehensive breakdown of those different groups in the research itself. Straight into some of the findings then. So to get an idea of the shape of the sector, the researchers talked to social workers about how they were feeling. And a quarter of social workers, current social workers surveyed would say that they have high morale, compared to about 2/5 that reported that their morale was low, and a third that said it was neither high or low. The researchers found that morale also appears to be linked to management responsibility. So those with no management responsibility were less likely to report high morale than those from upper management. Social workers in the NHS were also found to have the highest levels of morale, with 2/5 reporting it, followed by agency workers with a third, and 1 in 5 local authority staff reporting high morale. Also, despite the shifts in morale, most social workers surveyed remain proud to be part of the profession, and those with high morale were more likely to say that they were proud of the profession. So 96% of people with high morale said that they were proud, but this was actually still relatively high in those with low morale. So 72% of those that said they had low morale was still proud to be part of the profession, which was great. When the researchers asked individuals with lived experience of social work, most had positive perceptions of social workers, and felt the social workers have good intentions and make positive impact. Where there were negative experiences, these were attributed to individual social workers rather than the profession as a whole. And key reasons behind the poor experience included either a lack of time or a lack of resources. Some participants also shared that they had changed their opinion once they had engaged with their social worker. So going from fearful, not really understanding, to feeling like they were there to help. Many also recognised that the public often has negative perceptions of social workers, and a lack of understanding of the profession. Most felt that the public often hear those negative stories about social workers and rather than the positive actions that they do and the people that they help. Thinking about what motivates people to become social workers, perhaps unsurprisingly, a majority said that they did it to make a difference in people's lives. And that was the reason for both becoming and continuing to work as a social worker. Many social workers said that they had actually left previous roles to become a social worker because they felt that their previous role had been unfulfilling and quote meaningless, even if that had provided a higher salary. So they wanted to have a positive impact on the community through their work. Looking at a social worker's first role, 1 in 10 current social workers are still in their first role. 2 in 5 had left within the first 3 years, and around 1 in 10 had left within their first year. Those who work in adults are more likely to spend less than a year in their first role as a registered social worker, about 12% versus 7% of children and families social workers. But again, you can find a more comprehensive breakdown on that in the full report. In terms of reasons for leaving those first roles, a quarter did say that they'd left due to excessive workloads. That was one of the reasons, but an equal proportion had actually said that they'd left because they were promoted out of the role, which makes sense. For those that do stay in the profession, when asked about their motivations to keep working, like I said, the majority, 78%, had said that they do it to continue to make a difference. When looking at reasons for leaving, current agency staff are most likely to have left their first role because of high workload. They're also more likely to report wanting higher pay, or feeling that they weren't supported by their manager, or a lack of career progression. Whereas a local authority social worker is more likely to have left because of that promotion that we talked about. For those working with children and families, 28% had reported that they'd left because of high workloads, which is a bit of a higher rate than those working in adults. The 21% had said that was the reason. Overall, current social workers surveyed said that it tended to report, unfortunately, working in a process-oriented culture, with just over a third saying that their organisation is results-driven. But a 3 in 10 would say that their workplace is collaborative and flexible. Social workers in local authorities are the most likely to describe the organisation as process-oriented, with about 49% saying this compared to 39% of those whose main employer is an agency. 1 in 10 current social workers would describe their organisation as dynamic and creative, although this interestingly rises to 18% when you look at those who work in the NHS. There is a strong majority of social workers surveyed who feel that in their organisation, pleasingly, employers respect and value each other's opinions. And in the quality of interviews, those who spoke negatively about their organisation's culture often talked about overwork, underpaid, but unfortunately also bullying and racism. Where they did speak positively, or those where they spoke positively described it as supportive, collaborative, flexible, friendly. Those with a disability were less likely to say that they feel like they belonged in their organisation, with 63% saying that, compared to 71% of those who don't have a disability. Social workers spoke highly of their teams, though, and their managers, saying that they felt comfortable in their organisation and that they could use their co-workers as a resource when they were struggling, or if they had questions or needed a second opinion. And this was particularly true for early career and newly qualified social workers, which was great to hear. However, there was some frustration from some social workers saying that feeling like they frustration with the having to follow the bureaucratic processes, as they called it, and paperwork that takes time away from working directly with people. In terms of challenges for employers, participants thought that the main challenges for their organisations are high workloads and burnout, unsurprisingly. This is followed by a lack of applicants for vacancies and a skill shortage. In contrast, demand for flexible working arrangements or low productivity were not seen by the majority of social workers as being challenges. Off the back of this, social workers spoke of concerns about a potential, what they called, spiral in social services. So, you burned out social workers leave the profession, create more work for those that they leave behind, causing them to become fatigued, and leave the profession faster, and therefore contributing to that cycle that perpetuates. On vacancies and recruitment, the majority, 88% of social workers reported that their organisation had been recruiting in the past year. And this was higher for those working in a local authority at 95%, compared to those who are employed by an agency, which was 79%. Similar to the responses in the employer challenges, the biggest recruitment challenges raised were by those whose organisations had been recruiting was not enough applicants and not having the relevant necessary experience. Managers stated that burnout and workload were among their top concerns and contributors to low retention. The researchers talked to participants about what they thought might improve recruitment. And while many responses said that there had been no particular aspects of recruitment that had worked well in the last 12 months, interestingly, in a contrast to what we talked about before, one of the top phrases mentioned was positive experiences. In mind was flexible working. However, only 8% said that a hiring difficulty has been that they have not been able to afford flexible working hours, and 6% for not being able to offer remote or hybrid work. So because of that, it doesn't appear that flexible or hybrid working or being able to offer that or not is a barrier to recruiting social workers. Other solutions discussed were the use of agency staff. However, participants did recognise that this is more a kind of short-term, high-cost solution. And others looked to recruit international staff or potentially other healthcare professionals if the role allowed. A number of social workers were also keen on entry-level schemes such as apprenticeships, step up social work, and improving the approved and supported year in employment, the ASYE experience. Some mentioned that their organisations were able to offer financial incentives as well, such as retention payments or higher salaries or perks like free parking. And we were pleased to see that most who were interviewed believed that their organisations' initiatives to recruit a more diverse workforce were successful, and that there was no mention of any issues around diversity, equality, and inclusion in the profession as a source of issues with recruitment and retention. When looking to the future, though over 2/5 of social workers say that they would be likely to change employer type within the next 5 years, just under half, 48%, said that they would be unlikely to do so. Over half of those that had been in social work less than 3 years said that they were likely to move, compared to only 3 in 10 of those that had been in social work for 20 years or more. Those currently employed by an agency were most likely to say that they'll change employer type, with 65% saying this, much higher than the proportion of local authorities, where only 43% had said that they would look to move. Encouragingly, only 1 in 5 social workers think that they are likely to change to a different type of social work within the next 5 years, which is down from 28% in the 2020 research that I referenced earlier. In comparison, 72% don't think that they will change. However, most social workers have actively looked at other roles, and 8 in 10 have reported that they had done some kind of job searching in the last 12 months. Mid-career social workers were tended to be most likely to be looking for a new role, and over half, about 58% of those who were in the first 3 years had spoken to colleagues about jobs, but this rises to 73% of those that had been in their post 5 to 10 years. There's some division in the reasons given when social workers reported that they'd done some job searching, which was kind of dependent again on the length of time that they'd been practicing as social workers. Those with 10 or more years in the profession were more likely to cite a lack of career progression than those with fewer than 10 years, while those who'd not been in social work for as long were more likely to cite things like high workload, wanting higher pay, etc., than those that had got more than 10 years experience. When looking for other roles, social workers do tend to look within the profession. However, about a third of job seekers, job searchers, were looking at roles both within and outside social work, and 15% were only looking at roles outside the profession. Broadly, those looking at jobs were looking within their own specialism, but children and families social workers were slightly more likely to look for a different type of role. So, for example, 6% of children and families social workers were looking at adults' roles, and 13% were looking at both adults and children's. Whereas on the other hand, only 2% of adults were looking at children and families, and 5% were looking at both. When looking outside the specialism, social workers tended to look at roles within their current employer type, though. So local authority social workers would look at other local authorities. But that being said, there were some looking outside of that outside of their specialism, like 36% of local authority social workers, for example, were looking at agency roles or NHS roles. The researchers also talked to participants about additional work and a quarter of current social workers surveyed said that they'd taken on extra paid work in addition to their normal role within the last 6 months. This actually rises to a third of agency workers and 2/5 of NHS workers. So, but most of this additional work was extra hours within their main employer, as shown on the graph here, and about a quarter had taken up non-social work, and 1/5 had been doing bank or agency work alongside their main role. Within the next 5 years, 2/5 of social workers surveyed think that it's likely that they'll look to leave the profession. Unfortunately, this rises to 2/3 of those employed by an agency, and a quarter being very likely to leave within the next 5 years. More positively, though, just over half, 53%, said that they're not likely to leave the profession. And this is highest for staff within the NHS. 63% said that they're unlikely to leave. The proportions found here, interestingly, were also consistent with that 2020 research that I mentioned earlier, which indicates that there's been no change in a social worker's likelihood to leave social work. Furthermore, when they asked those who had left in the last 5 years why they'd left, many indicated that they moved to a different position within social work or due to personal circumstances, rather than specifically looking to leave social work. Similarly, just under a fifth, 17%, had left due to retirement. Around a third of former social workers reported either dissatisfaction with the standard of care that they were able to provide, or the impact that the work had on themselves personally. Social workers who have left the profession tended to move into health and social care or education, and current social workers who were looking to leave also predominantly looked in that area, as I'd said earlier. This can be seen in the more comprehensive list of where social workers who have already left social work have moved to, including a breakdown of where that 61% had moved to in health and social care. When asked if they would return to social work, 21% had said that they would be likely to return at some point in the next 5 years, and 16% had said that they'd be looking to return within the next 6 months. As mentioned earlier, qualitative findings highlighted a kind of a concern over the impact that social workers leaving the profession has on the services provided. And this was also felt amongst individuals with lived experience of social work. Reflecting on their personal experiences, though, only a few participants had actually experienced any kind of delay or negative experience with social work services. Lastly, the researchers talked to participants about improving retention. Current and former social workers cited a reduction of workloads, increased staffing levels, and increased support for the government as the top factors that would improve retention in social work. Social workers from an ethnic minority were more likely than white social workers to want changes to workplace environment, such as improved culture, more opportunities for remote or hybrid working, or more support from their managers or employers. Most social workers felt that in order to attract more people into the social work profession, there needs to be more understanding about the profession, about what social workers do. And many felt that some people are deterred from entering the profession due to that those negative associations we've talked about during the session. There was also a sense that the profession lacks recognition, and that social workers are not being rewarded for the work that they do, which leads us quite nicely into our next steps. There are some case studies at the end of the research, like with the perceptions research, that look at different perspectives of social workers or former social workers or people with lived experience or employers, etc. But other than that, I'll hand you back over to Paul, who will just quickly outline what we're doing about that.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Yeah, just you've got a moment to add any quick Q&A, any cues into the Q&A section, just while I kind of update you on what we're doing with the research. So it obviously will guide our understanding of the shape and the state of the social work as we kind of enter, the 5th year of our role as the regulator. So the findings are kind of broadly consistent with the intelligence that we've got through our, face-to-face online engagement activities with the sector about the workforce and all the challenges that we're aware they face. We've obviously completed our 4th renewal period in November last year, so the register continues to grow, and we've launched our annual survey. We'll launch our annual survey of social workers to make sure that we kind of have an open window onto changes in the profession. And the research, will be used to support some kind of, more visible work like the Change the Script campaign, which I mentioned, and do a hashtag search or have a look at our homepage for that. That's specifically to kind of inform and educate TV and filmmakers about the realities of social work and the responsibilities they have to kind of ameliorate some of those negative messages that they can put out, some misleading messages. No particular program named, but there'll also be lots of behind the scenes work as well. This will, individual findings and combinations will go into all the work that we do. So we facilitate a roundtable of other organisations where we, try and thrash out and articulate ways we can sort of help to alleviate some of those challenges. It will feed into all the kind of policy development work that we do in our team and the engagement work as well that colleagues will do. So it really is in there. And as I say, we publish it publicly so anyone can have a look and see, what's going on. So I hope it's been useful. I think we're going to have a quick thank you, and then we'll take any questions if any have come in.
Yes, thank you very much, Katie
Thanks.
and Paul, for your presentations. There's been a lot given us a lot to think about, and some very interesting material. So we'll hand over now to get some questions and answers.
Hi. I'm back now. So we've had a few questions come in. Some of them are may have been picked up actually during the course, but I'll leave that to you to answer. One about what is Social Work England doing to change the perceptions of social work?
Yeah, so I think as Paul mentioned, there's the Change the Script campaign. I think it is a really interesting finding that social workers feel less respected than the public feels that they are, or the participants thought that the public respect social workers. And we realise that a lot of that comes from people's exposure to social work, which is through media, through stories, through TV, through film, etc. So we've partnered with a company who's running a campaign for us, which is, like I said, called Change the Script, but it's aimed at targeting those negative perceptions of social work to portray a more realistic picture, just to provide a kind of an opportunity to inform and educate the public. So it starts with I think there's a small film on our website, but there's also a toolkit as well, which I think we can provide a link for in the chat, hopefully.
We will, and we'll provide a link to the research as well in the chat before we leave.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to rush in probably with one last question. It is a bit of one to end on. I wonder how, in the face of local authorities reporting squeezed budgets and staring down the face of bankruptcy, how as employers they can react positively to the research findings.
It's a bit of a $1 million question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll give you 3 minutes for it.
Thanks.
So I'm not sure that'll do it justice. But just to say, just quickly, we're going to share the research. So some of the questions that have come in have been specifically about specific pieces of research. When we share the research, the answer will be in that. But sorry, I'll hand you back, Katie.
No, sure. Yeah, it's challenging, isn't it? It is difficult. When you commission any research like this, you know that the findings are not always going to be positive, but we don't commission research to generate positive findings. We do it to generate a realistic and true evidence base to inform our work. Now, as the regulator, we are in some ways limited with the levers that we have to be able to influence things like recruitment and retention, or budgetary issues and costs and stuff at an employer level, whether that's in a local authority or in any other employer type. I think what what we hope it does is provide that evidence base for others as well, to be able to take that further with their own levers, with their own powers and opportunities, etc., to be able to change the script, to address those issues, to do what they can. And that's the purpose, as Paul said, of that round table, where we do come together, we do talk to employers, and we do talk about, as a system, what solutions are out there to be able to address the systemic problems that we are all aware of.
Thanks very much, Katie, and thank you very much, Paul. And we have had other questions coming in. I'm really aware that we won't be able to give them justice to a response at this point. So many apologies to the people who've asked questions, but we have put the links to the research into the chat, so some of the answers will be in the full documents. And I just want to thank, and if you can answer there is a survey in the chat as well. There's a survey and a feedback form, and would really appreciate it if people can answer those. I'd like to thank Katie and Paul and Sue as well for such an amazing session. It's been really, really interesting. We have recorded the session, so it will be available shortly on our YouTube channel, and we really hope you've enjoyed it. As I say, really appreciate it if you can provide feedback to us on the form provided. And we've also added a link to our a new annual survey that we're conducting for social workers, to gather thoughts on regulation, professional standards of social workers, and the role of social workers in society. So yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for attending. Do have a look at our sessions tomorrow, and yeah, really appreciate your time this afternoon.